Welcome back to Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I am your host, Joy Votrobek. Today I'll be speaking with our senior fellow, Alan Dowd, and we will be discussing challenging Russia in the Arctic. And yes, I said the Arctic, not the Ukraine. There was a lot going on over there. But Alan's latest article is called Rising to Russia's Arctic Challenge. You can find his article on our website and social media outlets. Please subscribe to our newsletter and consider donating or becoming a member of ASCF. Welcome back, Alan.
Always good to be here, Joy. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And this was a very timely, again, and interesting article on the Arctic, as we have been looking at it, at least myself. I know, I'm sure other listeners are aware, for the most part. Even though there's a lot going on in the Ukraine, Russia's also turned their attentions to the Arctic. So to dive right into your article, you talk in the beginning about Rimpac and possibly calling for the U.S., well, Admiral Michael Gilday calling for the U.S. and NATO allies to hold exercises similar to Rimpac, but for the Arctic. Do you believe, Alan, that a similar Arctic Rimpac would deter Russia, and what countries do you think would participate in this?
Let's take those good questions one by one.
Okay.
Yes, I do think it would deter Russia. I think Churchill's assessment of Moscow is still applicable today. There's nothing they respect more than strength. There's nothing they have more contempt for than weakness. That was true when it was called the Soviet Union. It's true under Putin and his neo-imperialist Russia. So yes, I do think it would deter Russia more than the current, lack of a better term, kind of uncoordinated patchwork. What we're dealing, we, the United States and its allies, are developing or confronting Russia with right now. So something like Rimpac, which stands for Rim of the Pacific, it's a big naval and air, it's led by Navy maritime forces effort in the Pacific. Many years in ongoing multinational allied exercise, and involves dozens of countries, sometimes into the three figures of vessels and aircraft. It's a huge exercise there in the Pacific, and it literally involves countries that want to participate that are on the rim of the Pacific. And Admiral Gilday, the outgoing CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, said this is something we should look at. He recently said this up in the Arctic, and he knows the effect of Rimpac, the importance of Rimpac, and he thinks we could do the same thing in the Arctic. His exact quote was, "I think we could do that up in the Arctic." So I definitely think it would work. Who would participate? I think all of the, what I call the NATO's Arctic 7. There are 7 members of NATO that are Arctic nations. I'm counting Sweden, by the way, which will be a member soon. I think all of them would participate, plus several others. The British have an Arctic policy strategy that they just put forth. The British are a power projecting country. I'm pretty confident other NATO nations would participate in a air naval exercise annually, or they could do it every other year to send a message to Moscow that you're not going to poach either the global commons or territories that are literally part of other countries, that sea or land territory. So yes, those are my answers. I think it's certain that it would deter Russia or help enhance deterrence, which those NATO 7, the Arctic 7, are already doing. I'm of the view that they just need to coordinate, and I think we're moving toward that really rapidly, which is good. And I think Sweden and Finland's entrance into NATO helps that. I think Russia's actions are contributing to that more than anything, and I can talk about that if you want to. But I definitely think that NATO needs to help be the coordinating body to help those NATO 7 defend the global commons, but also defend their interests and defend, some semblance of international order up there on the top of the world.
Thank you. And I think you made a good analogy there in your paper. We're talking about Russia claiming some 463,000 square miles of Arctic sea shelf, knowing that, like you said, a lot of it belongs to other countries. So they're doing something similar to what China is doing in the South China Sea. Very
much. They are. And it's a clever tactic. You basically use, it's kind of a circle. You use claims to justify presence and presence to justify claims. And that's kind of the tactic the Russians and the Chinese are both using in different parts of the world. And that just needs to be challenged. And I'm firmly of the view, as I think is Admiral Gilday and as are growing numbers of policymakers in the Defense Department and in the executive branch, that and in other NATO defense partners, that you just have to draw a line for the Russians, and then you need to defend that line. You just can't draw it; you have to defend it. So,
right, like you said, for Russia to get respect from us, that's
right, and that's where NATO's coordinating role can be very helpful, as it has, as you know, Joy, and our listeners know, as it was during the Cold War, or what I call Cold War I, and other parts of the world. You draw a line, you defend that line, and the Russians respect it, only because they fear the results.
I know we will. And I want to talk about their military buildup and ours, but before that, so speaking of China and the South China Sea, they also want in on the Arctic deal. They are in the observer position right now in the Arctic, but they don't have any territory or close to the Arctic. Do you find this to be problematic?
Yes. China, Beijing calls itself a near Arctic state, which is a silly term, and people, I think it would be wise and correct for the State Department and our allies to just call out the use of language. Words matter. When words lose their meaning, men lose their liberty, is an old phrase, and it just that's irrelevant. A near Arctic state, Thailand could say the same thing, I suppose, correct? I mean, right. So that's a silly thing, and so somebody should call them out on that. And then they're an observer state of the Arctic Council. The reason is the vast amount of natural resources that are in the Arctic, that all the Arctic nations know about. And those resources are going to be and are starting to be more accessible because of technology and because of some issues related to warming waters. And the Chinese want to get in on that, and they're trying to make a claim early on. They're not dumb. It's just they have really no justification to be part of that. But that's what they're trying to do. That you mentioned they're an observer nation of what's called the Arctic Council. I don't know if that. I wonder if that council will last much longer. To be honest, Joy, this is just my conjecture. But it has no defense component. It has existed a long time and has been effective at promoting cooperation, development based on principles of international law and, principles of territorial possession and such. But as Russia continues to just ignore all norms of behavior, I don't know if there'll be much need for that council. And the Russians, I could imagine, withdrawing from it. Now that every member of it except Russia is a member of NATO, they may just see it as a and this wouldn't be correct, but they could just conclude that it's a tool of NATO, So I don't know how much longer that will be around. That's my conjecture. But it's all about resources with China and with Russia, and trying to get a hold of some of those. It's a very resource-rich area with natural gas, minerals, and petroleum.
Yes, absolutely. And I believe that council, if I'm not mistaken in what I read, that it was Russia's turn right now to lead the council. Yeah,
they could be the chairman right now. I think it rotates through 1 or 2 year terms. But I don't think it's convening very effectively because of what's happened in Ukraine. Yes. There's just such a divide between those NATO members and Russia, and because of Russia's behavior. That's the thing that my article makes the point, and I know your listeners and American Security Council Foundation readers know it. We really need to emphasize this isn't NATO going and looking for a fight. This isn't the United States going to in search of monsters to destroy, to quote President Adams. It's Russia is doing things that are causing NATO to react, and our NATO and the United States individually are reacting, I think, properly. You know, when Russia starts to militarize, or we could say remilitarize, because it was militarized during the Cold War I. They're basing, S-400 air defense systems. They're putting in rebuilding or reopening military airfields, deep water ports to surge submarines and warships. They are setting up. They're kind of setting the stage for what you and I have talked about before in the South China Sea, known as anti-access area denial, A2AD, which is what the Chinese are doing with missiles. The Russians are kind of starting to set the stage for that in and around the Arctic. And so the NATO nations are awake to that and starting to respond to that. I think that's a good thing.
Yes, and in fact, you one step ahead of me there, Alan. Thank you. And I was going to say, in your article, you talk about the icebreakers, the 14 icebreakers, 6 bases, 14 airfields, and 16 deepwater ports, as well as the S-400 defense system. So what is the U.S. military's readiness to deal with that in the Arctic?
Well, I think as a informed citizen, I'd say it's better today than it was yesterday. But I also say I'm concerned that it needs to be better. And I think U.S. Military commanders will probably say something similar to that. That we have Americans. I don't know if Americans remember or appreciate that we are an Arctic nation. We're not a near Arctic state. A big chunk of our 49th state is inside the Arctic Circle. That's Alaska. And as you know, so that's the starting point. So if part of America is in the Arctic and the approaches to American territory are threatened by Russian activity, which they are, then we have there's a security component and a role to play. So, to their credit, I would submit that the Trump administration issued a policy directive about safeguarding U.S. interests, created an Arctic defense strategy. I think the Biden administration kind of took the baton, and the Biden administration recently established a new post in the Pentagon focused on Arctic security, which is a good thing. The Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Arctic Resilience created a whole of government strategy for the Arctic, and very bluntly said, here's a quote, Joy, U.S. seeks an Arctic region that is peaceful, stable, prosperous, and cooperative. But then it goes on to say very clearly, the U.S. will deter threats to the U.S. homeland and our allies by enhancing our capabilities required to defend our interests and our allies in the Arctic. And so we're starting to do that. The Biden administration redesignated, basically the Army had a presence in Alaska, and the Biden administration kind of consolidated and rationalized that presence and created stood up the 11th Airborne Division. It's based there in Alaska, 12,000 troops. The highest concentration of the Air Force's 5th generation warplanes, planes that you and I know as like the F-22 and the F-35, highest concentration is deployed in Alaska. We're having a higher number and a higher tempo and frequency of military exercises up there with allies. And I don't just mean up there in Alaska, I mean all around NATO's Arctic footprint, Alaska, Canada, over into Sweden, Finland, Norway. So these are, I think, good things, but I do think more needs to be done, more resources devoted to deterring Russian aggression, and then some better coordination among the Arctic 7.
And I think actually we just answered part of my peace through strength solutions there. So definitely more deterrence needed from the U.S.
And
in
allies.
particular, yep, for our allies and the U.S. But in particular, as you were talking about our airspace incursions by Russia.
So, they're back to Cold War levels. The British are saying, and this is. Again, people say the Americans or the NATO is looking for another Cold War to contrive an enemy. We have to have an enemy. No, Russia and China are acting like enemies. And so it's not that we're looking for an enemy, but if you start to have aggressive, air actions that violate our air defense identification zone in Alaska or violate the same ADIZ over with our NATO allies and what NATO calls the High North, you're acting like you did during the Cold War, and that's aggressive, and that's why we're responding like during the Cold War. It's kind of very simple, and those folks obviously, I think our listeners here are never guilty of this, but there's so many out, maybe out, in the main press that we hear sometimes blame America first. This is Russia has started down this path, and one thing. Well, there's many things America and its allies are good at, but one thing we're really good at is waging and winning and outlasting countries in a Cold War. We can do that. We know how to play this game, but we just need to maybe return to some of the tried and tested lessons of the Cold War One to do that, I think.
Yes, and going back a little bit and speaking about the Ukraine, so Russia's got a lot of plans and can gain a lot of resources from the Arctic. So with regards to the Arctic Council and what we were discussing earlier, why would they risk upsetting NATO over the Ukraine if they have so much potential in the Arctic?
I think that that's a whole other discussion about Ukraine, but and we've had a little of that, but I don't know if we ever talked about this aspect of it. The NATO nexus with Russia and Ukraine. He said that was one of his motivations to go in Ukraine because he wanted to stop Ukraine from joining NATO, and he wanted to stop the growth of NATO. Really, that's what he wanted, to stop the growth of NATO. I think that's kind of been laid bare as just a lie, one of his many lies, because if he was really anxious or bothered by the expansion of NATO, he would have moved against Sweden and Finland because they literally were joining NATO the last 12 months. And so I think about Ukraine, I think it is about his warped view of, totally false view of history, his total ignorance of Moscow's own actions in recognizing Ukraine, the whole sovereign territory of Ukraine. He never has respected that or believed that. So I think it really goes back to his warped view of Russian history and the fact that he's a kind of a neo-imperialist kind of czar type figure who's unchecked internally. I think the Ukraine aspect has a lot more to do with his warped view of internal Russian history and his view that Ukraine is just part of Russia, which it is not. It has history. It has been part of Russia, but it also has not been part of Russia. And some people make the point, you want to do this dance, Vladimir. Parts of Russia have been parts of other countries to the west. There's been times when other countries have controlled parts of Russia. We can you go far enough back, there's going to be a claim on every part of the world by someone else. But, in the post-Cold War world, we recognized here are the lines, sovereign nations, and they're not going to be changed by force. And he did that. Now, that you presented an interesting alternate history type question, Joy. What if he had moved against Ukraine in 2014 or in mass and in force and massively in 2022, and he had focused on kind of chipping away in a salami slice way at the Arctic? That would have presented the West, NATO and America with I think a harder challenge because it would have been less clear cut, Yeah. But in a sense, he he played a hand really, I think, stupidly and in Ukraine, and it made it very easy. Even fence sitters or those who might have been more open to giving him some benefit of the doubt said, well, this is beyond the pale, and he's changed German politics. He's changed Swedish, Finnish politics. Yep. And he's I think most Americans had a distrust for Putin. Obviously, there's a group of people who are blame America first types. There always is, as you and I know as students of history. I don't understand that, but they always exist through every crisis time. But I think he would have been wiser to do what your alternate history suggests and kind of chip away at little pieces of the Arctic. But that's not going to happen now because NATO's awake to the danger and coming together to deter him, and that's a good thing in the Arctic.
Yes. And he likely, again, brought that on him his own self. And
That's
I
right.
think what you said earlier was a good point, that he's unchecked, because if I would have to guess, I would think within his own country and his own government there that they have to see the advantages to the Arctic and the resources and not to mess with the NATO or even try to push that line with Ukraine.
That's right. And they, the resources are immense, and they could be developed. Some of the resources are Russian, and some of the resources are Canadian and Danish and Swedish and American and Finnish and Norwegian and Icelandic. But the way to develop them is through the rule of law and through the conventions and norms of international law and through accepted economic practices and accepted development practices. That's the way, and the way you define where one country's borders exist underneath the sea and the extended continental shelf and where your shelf ends. And those also can be done through international treaty, international cooperation, bodies like the Arctic Council. But Russia's not interested in doing that. Russia's interested in a fait accompli, seizing things, taking things, because that's the way empires behave, and that he is trying to run or revive an empire. But there's great resources there that can be developed and could be developed for the good of the world in an equitable way, based on territorial and sovereignty issues. But he's not willing to do that, and that's why then you have to just confront him with the only language he understands, Joy, and that is drawing a line, defending that line, and threatening force if you cross that line.
Yes, absolutely. And that we pretty much answered our peace through strength solutions of deterrence with both ourselves and our allies in the Arctic.
Good. Oh, that's good.
We're ready for any militarization that Russia poses or China wants to advance.
Right, and they are working. They are partners. I don't know if they're allies in the technical political science definition of allies or the way we define allies, but they certainly are partners. They certainly are working together. They certainly have a common enemy, and they agree on a kind of a common way of governance through autocracy and authoritarian rule. And they are working together, and they would be we would be silly or short-sighted not to think that China might assist Russia in some way or work with Russia in some way if it could get its tendrils into the Arctic.
Yes.
But I am happy or getting more comfortable with what NATO is starting to do, and I think those Arctic 7, as I call them. I think they are working together more. They're doing that on land and with maritime exercises and with air exercises. There's been a lot of NATO exercises the last we're almost August, the last 9 months or so in the high north. It's a very difficult place to conduct military operations, so training and drilling is very important. Equipment is key. Equipment maintenance is key. So they have to learn, and maybe a better term is relearn, because we did this during the Cold War. We, the alliance, they're relearning these militaries how to deter war, and if necessary, wage war in the Arctic.
Very important too. Well, thank you, Alan. I really appreciate your article and you coming on today. Talk to me about this and our listeners.
Always enjoy it. Always good to chat with you. And part 2 will be out whenever you publish
shortly.
Yes. So that'll be ideal in the second piece, a little bit more of what NATO's working on, what they're collaborating on.
Good. So that'll lead right into where we're talking about deterrence with our allies in the Arctic.
That's right.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to your next article, and so do our listeners. Be looking for Alan's next article coming out at the beginning of the month of August. I can't believe we're almost in August, but we are. So, Alan, thank you again. And to our listeners, you can read Alan's full article at www.ascf.us. That's our website, and if you would like to join our newsletter, you can sign up there. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter by typing in ASCF US. Subscribe and please comment on our YouTube and Rumble channels by typing in the American Security Council Foundation. Thank you, Alan, and thank you to our listeners. Please join us again next time for more Peace Through Strength podcast.